The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall read 41 degrees. Temperance Ashford had checked it 3 times in the past hour, each glance a small prayer, that the mercury might climb, that the thin red line might offer some mercy. It hadn't moved. The glass reflected nothing but her own face, pale and drawn in the lamplight, and behind her, the cabin that had become a tomb of cold air and failing hope. 3 in the morning, November 15th, 1887. The darkness outside pressed thick against the windows, transforming them into black mirrors that showed only the interior of this dying space. Tempe sat wrapped in the quilt her mother had stitched 20 years ago, back when quilts meant comfort rather than survival. The patterned interlocking rings called wedding bands mocked her now. 6 months since Daniel's funeral. 6 months of learning that marriage ends but debt does not. The wood stove radiated heat in a tight radius, maybe 4 feet at most. Beyond that invisible boundary, the air turned hostile. Tempe had fed the fire twice since midnight, splitting logs she couldn't afford to burn, watching flames consume wood that represented days of warmth she was trading for hours. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. The woodpile outside, which Daniel had cut and stacked in September before the tree fell wrong, before the foreman came to the door with his hat in his hands and his eyes unable to meet hers, that pile would last until mid-January if she was careful. But being careful meant the children froze at night. Being generous meant they all froze later. She rose from the chair joints, protesting the cold and the stillness, and crossed to the corner where Verity and Silas slept. 8 years old and 5. Old enough to understand hunger, but too young to grasp the deeper mathematics of survival. Verity lay curled on her side, dark hair fanned across the pillow Daniel had carved from pine. The child's breath emerged in small white clouds that hung in the air before dissipating. Tempe placed her palm against her daughter's forehead. Cold. Not the cold of sickness, not yet, but the cold of a body losing the battle to generate warmth faster than the air stole it away. Silas slept beside his sister, his face holding that transparency that comes before dawn. Skin stretched thin over delicate bones. His lips carried a faint blue tinge. Tempe knelt and pressed her ear close to his mouth, listening. The sound that came was shallow and raspy, each breath dragging through lungs that had grown tired of fighting. The cough had started 2 weeks ago, wet and deep, the kind that made Tempe think of drowning. Doctor. Halloran from Bitterroot Creek had listened to the boy's chest and said pneumonia was trying to take hold. Keep him warm, the doctor had ordered, as if warmth were a commodity she could purchase rather than a luxury she could no longer afford. She returned to the chair and opened the leather notebook she kept on the side table. Inside, 2 weeks of temperature records formed a story she didn't want to read. October had been cold. November was worse. Outside, temperatures had dropped below freezing every night since the 4th. Inside the cabin, even with the fire burning without pause, the warmest it had reached was 52 degrees. On the worst nights, it fell to 39. She turned to a fresh page and recorded the current data, November 15th, 3 a.m., interior temperature 41 degrees. Fire burning steady. Wood consumption 4 logs since midnight. The notebook also contained numbers of a different kind. Pages toward the back held her accounting of Daniel's debts. She had discovered them in the weeks after the funeral, hidden in a box beneath the floorboards where he kept important papers. The largest debt belonged to Cornelius Blackwell, owner of Blackwell's General Store, and the closest thing Bitterroot Creek had to a banker. $120 borrowed in February to purchase logging equipment. $20 repaid before Daniel died. $100 principal remaining plus 6 months of interest at 10%. The figure on the page read $152. The deadline was December 25th. Christmas Day. Cornelius Blackwell's idea of mercy. Tempe closed the notebook and stared at the fire. $152. She had $7.30 in coins hidden in a tin behind the stove. Daniel's tools might fetch another $15 if she could find a buyer before winter made travel impossible. That left her $130 short, and Cornelius Blackwell was not a man who accepted excuses or extended deadlines. He would take the cabin. In the middle of winter with 2 children, he would take the only shelter they had and turn them out into the snow. She had tried everything to stop the cold. 2 weeks ago, she had packed straw beneath the floorboards, crawling in the narrow space between the earth and the cabin's raised foundation, stuffing dried grass into every gap her hands could reach. It had helped for 3 days. Then the wind found new paths through threading between the boards with the persistence of water seeking cracks in stone. She had hung canvas around the foundation, securing it with rocks and strips of scrap lumber, building a skirt meant to block the wind that howled beneath the raised floor at night. The first real storm had shredded the canvas, left it hanging in frozen tatters that cracked like bones when she tried to remove them. The fire was the only defense left, and it was losing. She stood and walked to the door, pulling on Daniel's coat far too large for her frame, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips, and stepped outside into the November darkness. The cold hit with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and turning it into fog that hung in the still air. Above, stars burned with the hard brightness that only came when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. Beautiful and indifferent. The woodpile stood against the north wall of the cabin, each log a small monument to Daniel's labor. She had watched him cut and split this wood in September, his back bent to the work, his hands sure on the axe handle. Now she ran her palm along the split faces, feeling the grain, the dryness that made for good burning. He had chosen well, but there wasn't enough. There would never be enough. When she returned inside, Silas was coughing. The sound pulled her across the room before conscious thought could intervene. She helped him sit up, his small body shaking with the effort of expelling whatever lived in his chest. The cough was wet, productive, bringing up fluid that spoke of lungs filling with things that had no business there. Verity woke beside him, eyes wide in the lamplight, frightened by her brother's struggle. The coughing subsided after 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. Tempe gave Silas water from the bucket, breaking the thin skin of ice that had formed across the top, despite the bucket sitting near the fire. The boy drank and lay back down, his breathing more labored than before. She pulled the quilts tight around both children, tucking the edges under the thin mattress, creating a cocoon that might hold their body heat a little longer. Verity reached out and took Tempe's hand. Her fingers felt like ice wrapped in skin. "Is Silas going to be okay?" Tempe squeezed the small hand gently. She wanted to lie, to offer the comfort that mothers are supposed to provide, the assurance that everything would be fine. But Verity was too smart for easy lies, had already seen too much death in her short life. Her father in the ground. Mrs. Henderson's baby last winter. Old Mr. Talbot frozen in his cabin after his fire went out. He will be if I can keep him warm enough. But you can't keep him warm enough. The child's voice held no accusation, only the flat recognition of a truth too large to argue with. Tempe felt something crack inside her chest, a small fracture in the dam she had been building against despair. She kissed Verity's forehead and told her to sleep, then retreated to her chair before the child could see her face crumble. The sun rose late and weak, barely penetrating the heavy clouds that had settled over the valley during the night. Tempe made breakfast from cornmeal and water, cooking the mush over the stove and spooning it into wooden bowls. The children ate slowly, still drowsy, Silas's cough quieter, but not gone. After breakfast, she sent Verity to the woodshed to bring in kindling for the day. The girl wrapped herself in coat and scarf and stepped into the cold, making multiple trips with her small arms full of split wood. When she came back inside, her fingertips were white at the edges, bloodless. Tempe rubbed them between her own hands, trying to restore circulation, watching pink slowly return to the skin. Prudence Winthrop came by mid-morning with a basket of preserved apples. Prudence was a widow herself, 35 years old, with 3 children and a cabin a quarter-mile to the east. She had a kind face that worry had etched with premature lines and eyes that never quite stopped moving, always watching for the next disaster. "I saw your chimney smoke last night. You're burning a lot of wood." Tempe accepted the basket and set it on the table. "The cold has been hard." Prudence's gaze moved around the cabin, taking inventory. The thin layer of ice on the inside of the windows. The children huddled near the fire, wrapped in blankets despite the morning hour. The water bucket with frost forming at its edges. Are they well enough? Well enough. But Prudence's eyes said she knew better. They lingered on Silas, on the hollow look around his eyes, the way his breathing seemed to require conscious effort. She turned back to Tempe. Have you thought about a root cellar? Some families are digging them now to store potatoes and apples. It would give the children something to do. Tempe nodded but didn't commit. A root cellar. The idea felt quaint, like suggesting someone drowning should think about learning to swim. But after Prudence left, the suggestion lingered. Not a root cellar. Something else. She sat by the fire and let her mind drift back to Colorado, to the years before Montana, when her father was still alive and winter meant something different. He had been a miner working the silver veins near Leadville, and he had taught her things about the earth that most people never learned. She could still hear his voice, rough from years of breathing rock dust, explaining the way temperature changed with depth. 5 feet down, Katie, the temperature doesn't change. Summer or winter, it stays about the same. 50 degrees, maybe a bit more. The ground holds heat in a way the air never can. She opened her eyes and looked at the floor beneath her feet. The cabin was raised 6 inches above the ground, set on cedar posts that Daniel had sunk into the earth when he built this place. Beneath the floorboards was empty space, a crawl space that became a wind tunnel at night, pulling heat away from everything above it. The coldest part of the cabin was always the floor. The children's feet were always cold. The water bucket froze because it sat on boards that conducted cold upward from the moving air below. But what if there was no empty space? What if instead of air there was earth, solid, stable earth that held temperature the way her father had described? 50 degrees. Cold by any comfortable standard, but 50 degrees was survival when the air above dropped to 20 below zero. And if she built it beneath the cabin, the heat from the fire would seep down through the floorboards, warming the space below even more. The idea crystallized slowly, taking shape the way frost forms on glass. Not a root cellar. A room. A small room beneath the cabin floor, dug down into the earth, where temperature stayed constant, where wind couldn't reach, where the children could sleep without their breath turning to ice clouds. A place to survive. She stood and walked to the northwest corner where the children's bed was positioned. Kneeling, she pressed her hand flat against the floorboards. They were cold to the touch, drawing heat from her palm. She could feel the draft coming up through the cracks between the planks, cold air rising from the crawl space below. She pulled back the woven rug that covered this section and examined the boards more closely. They were well fitted but not perfect. Gaps existed, small but present, creating paths for cold to travel. An idea, just an idea, but ideas were all she had left. That evening after the children slept, Tempe lit a second lamp and carried it to the corner. She needed to see exactly what she was working with, needed to understand the structure before she could begin to change it. The floorboards ran north to south, each one 8 inches wide and an inch thick, nailed down with square-cut nails that Daniel had bought from Cornelius Blackwell. She selected 3 boards directly beneath where the children slept. If she could remove those 3, she would have an opening 24 inches wide and 8 feet long. Enough to begin. She fetched a flat piece of metal from Daniel's toolbox, a pry bar he had used for pulling nails. The first board resisted the nails holding tight after months of settling. She worked the bar beneath the edge and applied pressure, slowly listening for the creak of wood beginning to give. The sound came soft at first, then louder. The nail pulled free with a sharp squeal that made her freeze, breath held, waiting to see if the children would wake. They didn't stir. The second board came easier. The third easier still. When she had all 3 lifted and set aside, she looked down into the crawl space below. Darkness and the smell of earth. She lowered the lamp into the opening and peered down. 6 inches of clearance. Hard-packed soil, gray and frozen in the lamplight. Nothing moved down there. No rats, no snakes hibernating for winter. Just earth and the cold air that flowed across it. She replaced the boards, carefully fitting them back into place without nailing them down. When she spread the rug over the area again, no one would know anything had changed. She sat back on her heels and let herself imagine it. A room 5 feet deep, 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. Stone walls to prevent collapse. A ladder for access. Ventilation so the air didn't go stale. and at the bottom earth that stayed 50 degrees year-round, warmed by heat seeping down from the fire above. It would not be easy. Digging would take weeks working in secret while the children slept disposing of dirt without anyone noticing. She would need stones for the walls gathered from the creek and carried back in darkness. She would need wood for the ladder for the ventilation pipe. She would need strength she wasn't sure she possessed and luck she had never been given. But the alternative was watching her children freeze in a cabin she couldn't heat or losing the cabin entirely when Cornelius Blackwell came to collect his debt. The mathematics of survival were simple: dig or die. She began the next night, November 16th, at 4 in the morning, when even the wind seemed to sleep. She lifted the 3 boards again, moving them aside with hands that shook from cold and fear. The shovel she had chosen was small, meant for garden work rather than excavation, but it was all Daniel had left behind. She positioned herself above the opening and drove the blade into the earth. Resistance, immediate and absolute. The soil was frozen solid for the first few inches, compressed and hard as stone. She pushed harder, using her weight, feeling the shovel bite through with agonizing slowness. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin, metal scraping on frozen earth, small chunks breaking free and falling into the darkness below. She paused, listening. The children's breathing continued steady and deep. Outside, an owl called. The wind picked up, rattling the loose shutter on the east window, providing cover for the noise she made. She worked for 2 hours, stopping every few minutes to listen to make sure she hadn't woken anyone. The first 8 inches were brutal. Her hands developed blisters that burst and bled, making the shovel handle slick. Her back ached from bending at an awkward angle from lifting dirt and depositing it into a canvas sack Daniel had used for hauling tools. By the time gray light began to show in the eastern windows, she had removed perhaps 2 cubic feet of earth. A start, nothing more. She replaced the boards and swept away all traces of dirt, then carried the canvas sack outside in the pre-dawn darkness. The cold stole her breath, turned the sweat on her back to ice. She walked to the garden plot behind the cabin and spread the dirt thin across the dormant soil. If anyone saw, they would assume she was preparing the ground for spring planting. A woman alone doing the work her husband could no longer do. Nothing suspicious in that. The pattern repeated every night. 4 a.m. when the darkness was deepest and the settlement slept. Remove boards, dig, replace boards, hide the evidence. By November 20th, she had reached 12 inches of depth. By November 24th, 18 inches. The work became slightly easier as she broke through the frozen surface layer. Beneath 12 inches, the soil was softer, warmer, less resistant to the blade. She began to let herself hope. Then she hit the boulder. 28 inches down, the shovel struck something that rang like a bell in the confined space. Tempe froze, the sound still echoing in her ears. She cleared away the surrounding dirt with her hands, feeling in the darkness until her fingers found it. Stone. Cold and smooth and utterly immovable. She fetched the lamp and lowered it into the hole, leaning down to see what she had found. A boulder. Gray granite at least 2 feet across at the widest point she could see, extending in every direction she probed. She sat back on her heels and felt despair settle over her like a physical weight. All this work, all these nights of bleeding hands and aching muscles and the constant fear of discovery, and it ended here, stopped by a piece of stone she couldn't move, couldn't dig around without expanding the entire excavation beyond what the cabin's foundation could support. She tried for 3 days to defeat it. She attempted to dig around it, but the boulder extended too far in every direction. She tried breaking it with a pickaxe, but granite laughed at her efforts, showing only small scars where the metal struck. Her hands bled freely now, the blisters replaced by raw patches that wept clear fluid and refused to heal. Her shoulders screamed with pain that didn't fade even when she stopped digging. On the 4th night, November 28th, she sat at the edge of the hole and let the tears come. Quiet tears that ran down her face and dripped onto the dirt below. All this work, all this hope, and it would end because of a rock she could not move. Silas's cough had grown worse. His fever had spiked twice. Dr. Halloran had come again and left, shaking his head, saying there was nothing more he could do if she couldn't keep the boy warm. Verity had stopped asking questions, had retreated into a silence that frightened Tempe more than crying would have. "Mama, why are you crying?" Tempe looked up to find Verity standing beside her wrapped in the quilt, her small face serious in the lamplight. She wiped her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself. "Just tired, sweetheart." Verity looked down into the hole. She had known about the digging for a week now, had figured it out the way children figure out secrets adults try to keep. Tempe had sworn her to silence, and Verity had kept the promise, watching each night as her mother disappeared into the floor and emerged exhausted hours later. "Is the rock in the way?" "Yes." Verity knelt at the edge and peered down, studying the boulder with the same serious expression she brought to arithmetic problems. After a long moment, she looked up at her mother. "Can you dig next to it? Make the room a different shape." Tempe stared at her daughter. Make the room a different shape. The answer was so simple she wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. She had been thinking in rectangles, in the neat geometric spaces that made sense on paper. But there was no rule that said the room had to be a perfect square. If the boulder took up one corner, so be it. An L-shaped room would work just as well, maybe better. She pulled Verity close and kissed her forehead. "You're brilliant, my love." For the next week, Tempe adjusted her plan. She dug around the boulder, creating an irregular space that flowed around the obstruction rather than fighting it. The boulder became part of one wall, a feature rather than a failure. By December 7th, she had reached 3 feet of depth in most of the space, with one section still shallow where the stone dominated. By December 10th, 4 feet. The soil at this depth felt noticeably warmer when she touched it, retaining heat in a way the surface never did. On December 10th, just past midnight, someone knocked on the cabin door. Tempe was in the hole at the time, standing on loose earth with her head and shoulders still below floor level. The knock froze her in place, heart hammering against her ribs. She had been careful. So careful. Working only in the deepest hours, covering her tracks, avoiding questions. But somehow she had been discovered. The knock came again, firmer this time. She climbed out of the hole and replaced the boards as quickly as silence allowed, threw the rug over them, and crossed to the door. Her hands were covered in dirt, her clothes filthy. There would be no hiding what she had been doing. She opened the door and found Obadiah Thorne standing on the step, breath fogging in the cold air. Obadiah was the settlement's carpenter, a man of 48 with strong hands and a face weathered by decades of outdoor work. He had built most of the structures in Bitterroot Creek, including this cabin. He knew every beam and board, every joint and nail. He lived alone in a cabin on the eastern edge of the settlement, kept to himself, bothered no one. He was also the last person Tempe wanted discovering her secret. "Mrs. Ashford, may I speak with you?" Tempe stepped outside, closing the door behind her, unwilling to let him see the interior with its displaced rug and disturbed floor. "What is it, Mr. Thorne? I saw you last night, carrying something toward the creek." Her heart sank. She had thought herself alone when she disposed of the dirt, had believed the darkness would hide her. Apparently not. "I'm not here to judge, but I'm curious. What are you building?" Tempe looked at him for a long moment, weighing her options. She could lie, but Obadiah had eyes that saw through weak deceptions. She could refuse to answer, but that would only make him more suspicious. Or she could trust him. The carpenter who had known her father, who had built the cabin Daniel had died trying to keep. Sometimes the only choice left was to trust. "Come inside." She led him to the northwest corner and pulled back the rug. She showed him the floorboards she had removed, still loose in their positions. She gestured to the opening beneath, where lamplight reflected off dirt walls that were beginning to take shape. "I'm digging a room, 5 feet deep. The earth holds warmth better than air. My father taught me that. If I can build it right with stone walls and proper ventilation, it will stay warm enough to keep the children alive when the cabin can't." Obadiah knelt beside the opening and lowered himself part-way through, examining her work with the trained eye of someone who understood structure. When he emerged, his expression was thoughtful. "This could work. The principle is sound. 5 feet down, the earth is warmer. Stone holds heat. If you can get the ventilation right, this could save your life." Relief flooded through Tempe so strongly her knees weakened. "You won't tell anyone?" "No, but I will help you, if you'll allow it." "I can't pay you." Obadiah shook his head. "I'm not asking for payment. Your father saved my life once in the mines near Leadville. He pulled me out when a shaft collapsed. I never got to repay him. Let me help his daughter now." Tempe felt tears threaten again, but this time they came from gratitude rather than despair. "Thank you." Obadiah returned the next night with tools and materials. A better shovel designed for digging rather than gardening. A pickaxe for breaking through harder soil. A bundle of lumber that could be fashioned into a ladder. A section of metal pipe he had salvaged from an abandoned homestead suitable for ventilation. He didn't climb into the hole himself that remained Tempe's work, her labor, her creation. But he stood above and offered guidance, showed her how to angle the walls for stability, how to select stones that would fit together tightly, how to create ventilation that would allow fresh air without creating drafts. Together they worked through the nights, Tempe digging, while Obadiah hauled dirt and carried it to the garden. By December 14th, they had reached the full 5 feet of depth. The hole was now deep enough that Tempe could stand inside it without bending her head still below the level of the cabin floor. The walls were beginning to take shape, stone fitted to stone in rough courses that would prevent collapse. The space measured 8 feet long and 6 feet wide in the main section, narrowing where the boulder claimed its corner. On December 15th, Prudence Winthrop stopped by again. She stood in the doorway and looked at Tempe with eyes that held worry and something else. Suspicion, perhaps, or fear. "People are talking Temperance. They say you've been working in your garden at night, moving stones, digging." Tempe kept her voice steady. "I work when I have time." In December after dark. Prudence stepped closer. "Some say you're not well, that losing Daniel affected your mind. Reverend Crane asked me to check on you to see if you need help." The word help carried implications Tempe understood too well. Help meant intervention. Help meant people making decisions for her, deciding she was unfit, taking the children, putting them with families who could feed and house them properly. Help meant the end of everything she was fighting to preserve. "We're managing fine." Prudence didn't look convinced, but she didn't press. She left with a promise to return soon, and Tempe knew the clock was ticking faster now. The settlement was watching. Reverend Crane was watching. She needed to finish the room before someone decided to stop her. December 20th arrived with a sky the color of old iron. Tempe stood at the window watching clouds gather over the western mountains and knew that weather was coming. The air had that peculiar stillness that preceded storms, the pressure building until it broke into snow and wind. She had maybe 2 days before the storm hit. 2 days to finish walls that were only half complete, to install ventilation that existed only in Obadiah's sketches, to create a space that might save them or might become their grave if she got it wrong. At noon, Cornelius Blackwell arrived. He came in a small wagon, his tall frame angular against the gray sky, his face composed in an expression that might have been sympathy if Tempe didn't know better. He was 58 years old, a widower with no children, and a ledger that recorded every debt and credit with perfect accuracy. He believed in the sanctity of numbers, the immutability of contracts. He dismounted slowly and walked to the door. Tempe met him outside. She didn't invite him in. "Mrs. Ashford, I've come to discuss the matter of your debt." "I'm aware of it, Mr. Blackwell." "Are you—" He pulled a small ledger from his coat pocket and opened it. "According to my records, your late husband owed $100 at the time of his death. That was 6 months ago. With interest, the amount is now $152. $152. More money than Tempe had seen in a year. More money than existed in her world. I don't have that much. I assumed as much." Cornelius closed the ledger. "However, I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to extend the deadline for payment until the 1st of January. That gives you 12 days. 12 days. The words hung in the cold air between them. "And if I can't pay by then I'll be forced to take possession of assets equal to the debt. The cabin, most likely. It's worth more than $152, but I'm not in the business of splitting properties." Tempe felt the blood drain from her face. "You would take the house, in the middle of winter, with children." "I would prefer not to. But business is business, Mrs. Ashford. Your husband incurred this debt. It must be paid." She looked at him standing there in his good coat, his face showing nothing beyond mild regret at an unfortunate but necessary action. A thought occurred to her, born from desperation and the hours spent digging in the earth. "I have something worth more than money. Knowledge. A way to survive winter that could save lives throughout this settlement. I could teach you. I could teach everyone. That has to be worth something." Cornelius studied her with new interest. "What are you talking about?" Tempe chose her words carefully. "I've discovered something. A method of construction that provides warmth without burning excessive wood. If I shared that knowledge, taught others how to build what I've built, it could prevent deaths this winter and every winter after. Surely that has value worth forgiving a debt." For a moment she thought she saw something shift in his expression. Curiosity, perhaps, or calculation. But when he spoke, his voice remained flat. "I'm a merchant, Mrs. Ashford. I deal in goods and money, not ideas. If you want to trade me lumber or livestock, we can discuss it. But I don't trade in knowledge. Share it freely if you wish, but it doesn't settle your debt." He returned the ledger to his pocket. "I'll come back on Christmas Day. Have the money ready or prepare to vacate the property by the 1st of January. He climbed back onto his wagon and drove away, leaving Tempe standing in the cold, watching him disappear down the road. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Above the clouds lowered, darkening from iron to lead. The storm was coming. Cornelius Blackwell was coming, and she had 12 days to finish a miracle or watch everything she had built get buried beneath snow and debt. That night she worked with a fury born of desperation. The shovel bit into earth with violent strikes that made her shoulders scream and her hands bleed afresh through the calluses that had formed. Obadiah worked beside her above ground, laying stone walls with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime fitting materials together. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The work was everything now. By midnight they had completed 3 walls. By 2 a.m. the 4th wall was halfway done. Tempe's hands were shaking from exhaustion, her vision blurring at the edges. She climbed out of the hole and sat on the cabin floor, breathing hard, trying to marshal strength for another hour of work. Verity appeared beside her, wrapped in the quilt, her eyes serious and knowing. "Mama, you should rest." "I can't. The storm is coming." "I know." Verity sat down next to her mother, small and warm against Tempe's side. "But if you break yourself before it arrives, who will keep us alive after—" The wisdom in those words, spoken by an 8-year-old child who should have been dreaming of dolls and games rather than survival. And death broke something open in Tempe's chest. She pulled her daughter close and held her, feeling the fragile bones beneath the quilt, the steady heartbeat that depended entirely on choices Tempe made in the next few days. "Go back to sleep, sweetheart. I'll rest soon, I promise." Verity kissed her cheek and returned to bed, leaving Tempe sitting in the lamplight with dirt under her fingernails and defeat threatening at the edges of her resolve. But defeat was a luxury she couldn't afford. She stood, picked up the shovel, and climbed back into the hole. By dawn on December 21st, the winter solstice, the walls were complete. Stone stacked on stone, wedged tight with smaller rocks and clay forming barriers that would hold back the earth and create a space inside where warmth could gather. Obadiah had installed the ventilation pipe, angling it up through the foundation and disguising it as drainage. He had built a ladder from scrap lumber, sturdy enough to bear weight, narrow enough to fit through the opening. He had created a wooden platform for the floor, raising it 6 inches above the bare earth to provide insulation and keep bedding dry. Tempe descended the ladder for the first time in daylight, carrying a lamp and a thermometer she had borrowed from Dr. Halloran under the pretense of monitoring Silas's fever. She hung the thermometer from a nail she had driven into the stone wall and waited, standing in the center of the space she had created with bleeding hands and desperate hope. 5 minutes passed. Outside, the temperature was 15 degrees. Inside the cabin near the fire, it was 48 degrees. Down here in the earth, surrounded by stone walls that held heat the way Tempe's father had promised, the thermometer read 52 degrees. She climbed back up and found Obadiah standing at the edge waiting. "It works." His face split into a smile that transformed his weathered features. "It works." That evening she brought the children down for the first time. She lit the oil lamp and led them to the corner, pulling back the rug to reveal the trapdoor. Obadiah had installed a simple hinged cover with a handle that hid beneath the woven fabric. Verity looked uncertain. Silas's eyes were wide with fever and wonder. "What is it?" "A place to keep us warm. Come, I'll show you." She went down the ladder first, then helped Verity descend, her daughter's small hands gripping the rungs with determination. Silas followed his movements, slow but steady. When they were all inside, Tempe closed the trapdoor above them. The lamplight flickered against the stone walls, casting dancing shadows that made the space feel alive. The air was still warmer than anything they had felt in weeks, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something else. Safety, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. Silas reached out and touched the wall, his palm flat against the smooth stones Tempe and Obadiah had chosen from the creek. "It's not cold." Verity sat on the wooden platform and wrapped her arms around her knees. "It's quiet." That night they slept in the earth for the first time. Tempe had brought down blankets and quilts, creating a nest on the platform where 3 bodies could fit if they stayed close. The children fell asleep within minutes, their breathing deepening, their faces relaxing in a way Tempe hadn't seen since October. She lay between them, listening to the silence that came from being 5 feet below the surface, insulated from wind and cold and the weight of a world that wanted to crush them. Outside, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees. The wind began to pick up the first edges of the storm, feeling its way into the valley. But here in the small room beneath the cabin floor, the thermometer read 58 degrees. The stone walls held warmth. The earth did its work. They slept through the night, all 3 of them, without shivering, without waking to stoke fires that couldn't keep pace with the cold. When Tempe woke, Silas's cough was quieter. Verity's fingers were pink rather than white. And for the first time since Daniel died, Tempe allowed herself to believe that they might survive this winter, that the room she had built with bleeding hands and her daughter's wisdom might be enough. But winter had only just begun. The storm was gathering strength over the mountains, and in 9 days Cornelius Blackwell would return to collect his debt, expecting either money she didn't have or possession of the cabin that now contained the only thing standing between her children and death. The wind outside rose to a howl. Snow began to fall thick and heavy, covering the world in white. Tempe climbed the ladder and emerged into the cabin to find ice forming on the inside of the windows. The fire burned in the stove, consuming wood, achieving nothing. She closed the trapdoor behind her and stood in the cold cabin, looking at the thin barrier between this frozen space and the warm room below. 12 days until Christmas. 12 days until Cornelius came for what he believed was his. The room was finished. The storm was here. And the real test of what she had built, of whether love and desperation and her father's wisdom about the earth could overcome debt and winter and the mathematics of survival, was about to begin. Morning light came weak through windows layered with ice. December 21st, and the world outside had transformed into something hostile and foreign. Tempe stood at the eastern window, watching clouds press down from the mountains like a lid closing over the valley. The air tasted of metal and ozone, the particular flavor that preceded serious weather. Birds had vanished. Even the wind held its breath. She checked the outdoor thermometer mounted beside the door. 23 degrees at 9 in the morning. By afternoon it had dropped to 18. By dusk, 14. The fire in the stove consumed wood at a rate that made her stomach clench, but the cabin temperature refused to climb above 44 degrees. The battle was already lost up here. The real question was whether the room below would hold. Obadiah came by as darkness fell, carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, dried venison hardtack, a jar of preserved cherries, 3 candles. "For the storm. You'll need supplies if you're going down there for days." Tempe accepted the bundle, throat tight. Kindness still existed in the world, even when the world was ending. How bad will it get? Telegraph operator in Helena says the worst in 40 years. Temperature dropping to 20, maybe 30 below. Wind strong enough to knock a horse down. Snow measured in feet, not inches. He looked past her into the cabin at the children sitting near the stove, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Get them below tonight. Don't wait. When it hits, it'll hit fast. After he left, Tempe gathered what they would need. Food enough for a week if they were careful. Water in clay jugs, 4 gallons, that she lowered through the trapdoor using rope. The oil lamp plus 2 spares. Matches in a tin box. Blankets and quilts until the platform disappeared beneath layers of fabric. The Bible her mother had given her, not for faith, but for the comfort of familiar words. A deck of cards to keep Verity occupied. The small wooden horse Daniel had carved for Silas last Christmas. By the time she finished, snow was falling. Not the gentle flakes of a normal storm, but hard pellets that struck the windows like thrown sand. The wind rose from whisper to moan to something that sounded alive and angry. Temperature outside 8 degrees and dropping. Tempe fed the stove one last time, building the fire high enough to keep the chimney warm, but low enough to last through the night without feeding. Then she gathered the children and led them to the trapdoor. Verity went first, climbing down with the confidence of someone who had made this journey before. Silas followed slower, his hands uncertain on the rungs. Tempe came last, pulling the trapdoor shut above her head and descending into earth that smelled of stone and safety. The thermometer on the wall read 50 degrees. Outside, the storm found its voice and began to scream. They slept that first night in a cocoon of quilts, the 3 of them pressed together on the wooden platform, sharing warmth the way animals do when winter comes. The lamp burned low, casting shadows that danced across stone walls Tempe had built with hands that still bore scars from the work. Above them, muffled but audible, the wind hammered at the cabin, seeking entry, seeking victims. But down here the air remained still. Cold by any standard of comfort, but 50 degrees was a gift when the world above had descended into killing temperatures. Tempe woke once in the night to silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of held breath, of something massive gathering strength. She lay in the darkness, listening to her children breathe, and tried not to think about the cabin above them, about whether the wind might tear it apart and leave them buried beneath wreckage and snow. But the walls held, the earth held, and eventually she slept again. December 22nd arrived without announcement. Down here there was no sunrise, no shift from dark to light, only the moment when Tempe opened her eyes and decided to call it morning. She climbed the ladder and pushed against the trapdoor. It resisted, then gave way, and she emerged into the cabin to find a world remade. The windows were completely obscured not by frost but by snow pressed against the glass from outside. When she opened the door, a wall of white greeted her, 3 feet of accumulation piled against the entrance during the night. The wind hit like a physical attack, stealing breath, burning exposed skin with cold that felt sharp enough to cut. She forced the door shut and stood in the cabin, heart racing. The thermometer inside read 38 degrees despite the fire still burning in the stove. She fed it more wood, watching flames flare and achieve nothing against cold, pouring through every gap in the walls. The water bucket had frozen solid. Ice coated the inside surfaces of every window. Her breath emerged in clouds that hung visible in the still air. She descended the ladder and found both children awake, watching her with eyes that asked questions they were too afraid to voice. "We're staying down here, for as long as the storm lasts." Verity nodded, accepting this new reality with the adaptability of someone too young to be this old. Silas coughed once, a wet sound that made Tempe's chest constrict, but then he settled back against the quilts without complaint. They ate breakfast in the lamplight, hardtack softened in water venison, tough and salty. The cherries Obadiah had brought doled out one each, a small brightness in the gray morning. After eating, Verity asked for a story, so Tempe told her one. Not from the Bible or from memory, but invented whole, about a girl who lived in a cave beneath a mountain and learned the language of stones. The story lasted an hour. When it ended, Verity asked for another, so Tempe invented one about a boy who could talk to the wind and convinced it to be gentle during winter. The lies came easily when the truth was too terrible to speak. Around midday, or what she guessed was midday time, becoming elastic down here, where no sun marked its passage, Tempe climbed up to tend the fire. The temperature in the cabin had fallen to 35 degrees. Outside, visible through cracks around the doorframe, the world was white chaos. Wind drove snow, horizontal visibility reduced to nothing. The outdoor thermometer, barely visible through the ice-caked window, read -4 degrees. She added wood to the stove and stood close to it, letting heat soak into her bones for the brief minutes she could afford to stay above. The cabin felt like a corpse, cold and rigid. All life fled to the warm space beneath the floor. She thought about the other families in Bitterroot Creek, about whether they were surviving or dying, and felt guilt rise bitter in her throat. If she had shared what she was building, if she had taught others instead of working in secret, would fewer people be dying right now? But if she had shared, someone would have stopped her. Reverend Crane or Cornelius Blackwell, or just the weight of community opinion declaring that a widow digging holes in the middle of the night was proof of madness rather than wisdom. The secret had been necessary. That's what she told herself. That's what she needed to believe. She returned to the earth and closed the trap door, sealing them in warmth purchased with weeks of bleeding hands and desperate hope. The afternoons stretched into evening, stretched into night. They rationed the lamp oil, burning it for 2 hours, then darkness for 2 hours, then light again. In the dark periods, Tempe held both children and sang songs her mother had taught her, ballads about ships and storms and lovers separated by distance. Verity's voice joined hers, thin and sweet. Silas fell asleep against her shoulder, his breathing still raspy but steady. During the light periods, Verity played with the cards, building houses that collapsed and were rebuilt over and over, a meditation on persistence. Silas watched the shadows on the walls, finding shapes in the dancing light, dragons and horses, and his father's face, though he didn't say that last part aloud. Tempe checked the thermometer every hour. 48 degrees. 49. 50. The temperature down here responded to the fire above, to heat seeping through floorboards and warming stone walls that then radiated it back into the space. Not warm by any standard except survival. But survival was all they needed. Above them the storm intensified. Even 5 feet below ground they could hear it, a constant roar that rose and fell like breathing, like some massive animal circling the cabin looking for weakness. The sound invaded dreams, turned sleep restless. But they were alive. That was what mattered. The second night, December 23rd, brought a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Tempe woke to it, pulling free from sleep like someone drowning who finds the surface. A rhythmic pounding, distant but distinct. Metal on wood, someone knocking. She lay still, listening, wondering if exhaustion had conjured phantoms. But the sound came again, urgent now, desperate. She climbed the ladder in darkness, unwilling to waste lamp oil on what might be imagination. At the top she paused, ear pressed to the underside of the trap door, listening. The pounding came from the cabin door, not directly above her, but audible through the wood and stone. Real. Someone was out there in the storm, seeking shelter. Tempe pushed up the trap door and emerged into cold that felt like a living thing trying to consume her. The fire had burned down to embers. She added wood with shaking hands, then crossed to the door. The pounding came louder now, frantic. She pulled it open, and Prudence Winthrop fell across the threshold. Behind Prudence came her children, a girl of 7, a boy of 5, and cradled in Prudence's arms, a 2-year-old boy who wasn't moving. They were covered in snow, not dusted but encrusted ice clinging to hair and clothes and eyelashes. Prudence's lips were blue. The children's faces held the blank expression of people who had passed beyond fear into simple exhaustion. The smallest child's skin looked waxy, translucent, the color of candles. "Please," Prudence's voice came raw, barely audible. "Our chimney. It cracked. Cabin filled with smoke. We couldn't breathe. Nowhere else to go." Tempe didn't hesitate. She pulled them inside, slammed the door against wind, trying to follow them in. Prudence collapsed to her knees, still holding the youngest child. The other 2 children stood motionless, shock rendering them statues. Tempe knelt and placed her hand on the small boy's face. Cold. Deeply, terribly cold. His chest moved, but barely breath so shallow she had to watch for 30 seconds to confirm it was happening at all. Hypothermia. Advanced. Maybe minutes from death. Come. Now. All of you. She led them to the trapdoor, helped Prudence descend first, the woman moving like someone underwater, every motion requiring conscious thought. The older children followed, their hands clumsy on the ladder rungs. Tempe came last, the smallest boy in her arms, his body limp and frighteningly light. Verity and Silas stared at the newcomers with wide eyes. The space that had felt adequate for 3 people suddenly seemed impossibly small with 7. The platform built for a family was now expected to hold 2 families, and the air already felt thicker, harder to pull into lungs. Tempe wrapped the youngest child in dry blankets, held him against her body, willing heat from her flesh into his. Prudence sat beside her, teeth chattering so hard speech was impossible. The other children huddled together, too cold to cry, too exhausted to do anything but exist in this new reality. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. The small boy remained still and cold and barely breathing. Tempe pressed her ear to his chest, listening for a heartbeat, finding it faint and irregular. She rubbed his hands between hers, trying to force circulation back into fingers that felt like frozen twigs. Then, barely perceptible at first, color began to return. Not healthy pink, but better than the wax pale of near death. His breathing deepened fractionally. His eyelids fluttered. After 20 minutes he made a sound, a small whimper that might have been pain or confusion or simply the protest of a body returning unwillingly to consciousness. Prudence began to cry. Silent tears that ran down her face and dripped onto the stone floor. She reached out and touched her son's face with fingers that were themselves still white at the tips. "Thank you." The words barely audible. "Thank you." But gratitude couldn't change the mathematics of the situation. 7 people in a space designed for 3. A ventilation pipe meant to supply air for 3 sets of lungs now expected to serve 7. Food rationed for 3 mouths, suddenly feeding 7. The lamp oil she had calculated to last a week might last 3 days, with 7 people needing light to maintain sanity in the darkness. And the air. Already she could feel it, a heaviness in her chest, a sense of breathing, something depleted. The room had been perfect for 3. For 7 it might become a tomb. Verity moved closer to Tempe, her voice a whisper. "Will there be enough air?" The question every adult was thinking, spoken by a child too young to know some truths, should remain unspoken. Tempe looked around at the faces watching her, Prudence and her 3 children, her own too, all of them depending on decisions she made in the next seconds. "We'll take turns going up to the cabin. Open the door briefly. Let fresh air in. We'll manage." The words sounded more confident than she felt, but confidence was another thing she could manufacture when necessary, along with warmth and safety, and the illusion that 7 people could survive in a space meant for 3. They organized shifts. Every 2 hours, 1 adult would climb up, endure the killing cold of the cabin, open the door for 30 seconds, to let fresh air sweep in, then return to the earth. Tempe took the first shift, emerging into the cabin to find it had become an ice cave. 30 degrees despite the fire she fed with wood they couldn't afford to burn. She forced the door open against accumulated snow and wind that screamed triumph at finding entry. Cold poured in, brutal and absolute. She counted to 30 while her skin burned and her breath froze in her lungs. Then she slammed the door and descended back to relative warmth, shaking so hard she could barely grip the ladder rungs. An hour later, her core temperature had stabilized enough to stop shaking. Then Prudence took the next shift, climbing up and returning 10 minutes later with ice in her hair and her face the color of old bone. The pattern repeated through the night, up into cold that could kill in minutes. Door open, air rushing in with the force of something that had been denied and finally found entry. Door closed, descent back to the earth. Recovery period where the person who had made the journey sat wrapped in blankets, teeth chattering, skin slowly warming from white to pink. The children slept piled together on the platform, 7 bodies sharing heat like puppies in a den. There wasn't room for all of them to lie straight, so they curled and overlapped legs, tangled arms, draped across siblings and strangers without distinction. In sleep, they were simply small mammals seeking warmth. All human divisions of family and ownership dissolved into basic survival. Tempe sat against the wall during her rest period and tried not to think about how much lamp oil they were burning, how fast the food was disappearing, how the air tasted increasingly stale despite their shifts to bring freshness down. The ventilation pipe was doing its work, but it had been sized for 3 people, breathing normally, not 7 people in various states of stress and fear breathing hard and fast. Prudence sat beside her, both women too exhausted for conversation, both understanding without words that they were engaged in a desperate mathematics of survival. If the storm lasted 3 days, they might make it. 4 days would be harder. 5 days or more and choices would have to be made. Choices about who went up for air and who stayed below. Choices about whether 7 people slowly suffocating together was better or worse than some of them dying quickly so the others might live longer. Dawn came unmeasured and unmarked. The storm continued. Tempe climbed up for her shift and found the cabin had grown colder still, the thermometer reading 28 degrees. Outside, visible through gaps in the doorframe, the world was nothing but white movement. Snow and wind and cold that had gone beyond temperature into something metaphysical. The death of warmth, the absence of mercy. She opened the door and was nearly knocked down by wind that hit like a fist. Snow swirled in, covering the floor in seconds, accumulating in drifts against the furniture Daniel had made. She counted to 30 each second an eternity, then fought the door closed against wind that didn't want to be shut out. Back below, the children were waking. They ate breakfast in portions that made Tempe's stomach clench, quarter pieces of hardtack, sips of water measured in ounces. Prudence tried to smile at her children to project normalcy, but the fear leaked through in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands shook when she poured water into wooden cups. The day passed in increments too small to measure. Shifts up into cold, shifts below in warmth that felt increasingly fragile. Stories told to keep children occupied, songs sung to keep spirits from breaking. The lamp burning and being extinguished and burning again, each lighting consuming oil they couldn't replace. Silas's cough returned the wet rattling sound that Tempe had hoped the underground warmth would cure. He coughed until he vomited, bringing up thin bile that Tempe cleaned with rags and tried not to see as an omen. Prudence's middle child. The 5-year-old boy developed a nosebleed that wouldn't stop blood running down his face until Prudence held him upside down, a folk remedy that seemed barbaric, but somehow worked. Evening came, marked only by Tempe's internal clock saying it must be time for darkness to fall above. They ate dinner portions even smaller than breakfast. The hardtack was half gone. The venison would last maybe 2 more days. After that, they would be down to the cherries, and then nothing. That night, Tempe took the midnight shift, climbing into the cabin to find it had crossed into new territory, 25 degrees inside. The fire still burned but accomplished nothing against cold that had become absolute. She fed it more wood, watching flames that seemed decorative rather than functional. The outdoor thermometer, barely visible through ice-obscured glass, read -26 degrees. She opened the door and the wind tried to rip it from her hands. Snow drove horizontal, each flake a tiny blade cutting exposed skin. She counted to 30 while her face went numb and her fingers lost feeling. Then she slammed the door and stood in the frozen cabin, trying to will warmth back into extremities that had gone white and lifeless. Her hands wouldn't work properly on the ladder. She descended using arms and knees, gripping rungs with the crook of her elbows because her fingers wouldn't close. At the bottom, she collapsed onto the platform and Prudence wrapped her in blankets while Verity rubbed her hands, trying to restore circulation. It took 40 minutes before she stopped shaking, an hour before her fingers regained color. In that hour, she understood with perfect clarity that they were trapped between 2 forms of death. Stay below and suffocate slowly as 7 people consumed the limited air faster than the small pipe could replace it. Go up too often and freeze in the cabin that had become uninhabitable. The margins for survival were shrinking with every shift, every hour, every breath. The 3rd day of the storm brought a change. not in the weather, which continued its assault with undiminished fury, but in the people. The adults stopped talking except when necessary. The children grew quiet, sensing the tension, understanding in the way children do that something was wrong beyond the obvious wrongness of being trapped underground during the worst storm in 40 years. Prudence's youngest, the 2-year-old who had nearly died that first night, began to cry. Not loud wailing, but a continuous soft whimpering that set everyone's nerves on edge. Nothing would comfort him, not food or water or his mother's arms or songs or stories. He simply cried, and the sound filled the small space until it felt like a physical presence, another inhabitant competing for air and space and sanity. The lamp oil was down to perhaps a day's worth if they burned it carefully. After that they would have candles, and after candles darkness. Tempe tried to imagine 7 people in this space with no light, tried to calculate how long human minds could endure that before breaking, and found she couldn't complete the math. That evening, during Prudence's shift up to the cabin, the woman came back down, white-faced and shaking. "It's getting worse. Temperature -30 now. Wind so strong I could barely hold the door. Snow piled higher than my waist when I opened it. If this continues another day, we won't be able to open the door at all. We'll be sealed in." Sealed in with a ventilation pipe designed for 3 people and a food supply measured in hours rather than days. Tempe felt the walls pressing closer, felt the air growing thicker in her lungs. This was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with a whisper, 7 people slowly suffocating in a hole in the ground while a storm raged above, indifferent to their struggle. But the storm finally began to weaken. December 26th, and the sound above changed. The constant roar that had been their companion for days diminished to a steady blow, then to occasional gusts, then to something almost resembling silence. Tempe climbed up for her shift and found the cabin still frozen but no longer actively hostile. She opened the door and saw sky for the first time in 4 days. Not blue, the clouds remained thick and gray but visible. Actual sky rather than white chaos. The temperature outside was -12 degrees. Brutal, but survivable for brief periods. The wind had fallen to nothing, leaving a stillness that felt unnatural after days of constant movement. Snow had drifted to 5 feet in places, completely burying the lower portions of the cabin, transforming it into a structure half swallowed by white earth. She stood in the doorway and looked out across what remained of Bitterroot Creek. Smoke rose from some chimneys. Not all. Not nearly all. When she descended and told the others, relief flooded through them like a physical thing. Prudence wept openly. The children began to talk again, voices rising in volume and pitch as tension released. They had survived. 7 people in a space meant for 3, they had survived the worst storm in 40 years. But survival came with a price that became clear over the next hours as people emerged from their homes and began to move through the settlement. Tempe heard voices outside, then saw Obadiah through the window checking on her. She climbed up and met him at the door. His face told her everything before words formed. He spoke anyway, giving shape to the tragedy. 4 dead. Henderson and his oldest son ran out of firewood on the 3rd day. Tried to burn furniture. Smoke from green wood filled their cabin. They tried to escape into the storm, found them frozen 50 feet from their door. He paused, gathering strength to continue. Mrs. Peyton died in her sleep. Fire went out. She was 73. Didn't have the strength to keep it burning. William's family lost their youngest daughter, 4 years old, pneumonia during the storm. Without warmth or proper medicine, she just faded. 4 dead out of a settlement of maybe 80 people. 5% of the population gone in 4 days. And how many injured? How many with frostbite or pneumonia or damage that would kill them slowly over the coming weeks? Tempe thought about the room beneath her feet, about 7 people who had survived when others died. She felt gratitude and guilt in equal measure, 2 emotions so tangled she couldn't separate them. If she had shared her knowledge earlier, if she had taught others how to build what she built, would those 4 people still be alive? But she had been afraid. Afraid of being stopped, of being declared insane, of having this chance at survival taken away by people who thought they knew better. The fear had been reasonable. That's what she told herself. But 4 people were dead, and reasonable fear offered no comfort. Prudence gathered her children, preparing to return to their cabin. Before she left, she took Tempe's hands. "You saved us. My children would be dead without what you built." The words should have brought comfort. Instead, they felt like an indictment. Some saved, others dead. The mathematics of survival were always cruel. After they left, Tempe stood in the cabin and watched through the window as people emerged from their homes. She saw Marcus Carlson, the blacksmith, his hands wrapped in bandages. She saw Catherine Porter helping her husband walk, his movements stiff and painful. She saw Reverend Crane moving between houses, checking on families, his face drawn with grief. And she knew that when the settlement gathered to mourn their dead, someone would ask the question that had no good answer. Why did some survive when others died? And the answer, because one woman dug a hole and kept it secret, would not satisfy. It would enrage. By afternoon, the death toll was confirmed. 4 dead, 12 others seriously injured. Frostbite severe enough to require amputation, pneumonia that might yet claim more victims, burns from desperate attempts to stay warm using methods that should never be tried. That evening, Verity asked the question Tempe had been dreading. "Are people angry with us?" Tempe looked at her daughter, this 8-year-old child who understood too much, and asked questions that required lies to answer kindly. "Some will be, because we lived and they didn't." "Yes." Verity thought about this, her face serious. Then, "But you couldn't have saved everyone. Even if you told them about the room, some people wouldn't have believed you, or they wouldn't have had time to build one, or they would have built it wrong." The words came from a child's mouth, but carried adult logic, the kind of rationalization that allowed people to live with impossible choices. Tempe pulled her daughter close and wondered when Verity had lost the right to be a child who believed in simple morality and right and wrong without the gray spaces between. The next day brought visitors. First Obadiah, who had survived in his own cabin through careful rationing of wood and food. Then Rebecca Walsh and her family, who had weathered the storm by burning furniture when their wood ran out, but had managed to keep their fire going through sheer desperate effort. And then came Catherine Porter. She stood at the door, her face hard, her eyes bright with something that might have been grief or rage or both. Her husband Marcus stood behind her, his hands still bandaged from the frostbite that had cost him 3 fingers. "You could have saved them." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Tempe stood silent, unable to form words that would make this better. "You could have told us what you were doing, taught us, but you kept it secret. And now people are dead. Now my husband can't work, can't grip his tools. We have 4 children, and he can't work." The pain in Catherine's voice cut deeper than anger would have. This was grief given shape loss, needing somewhere to land. "I didn't know the storm would be this severe." "Does that matter? You had knowledge that could have saved lives. You kept it to yourself. And now 4 people are in the ground and my husband is crippled." What answer existed for that? Tempe had been afraid. Fear was reasonable, but reasonable fear that led to preventable death was still culpability dressed in justification. Catherine left without waiting for a response, and Tempe stood in the doorway watching her go, feeling the weight of choices made and consequences borne by others. That night, the settlement held an emergency meeting at the church. Tempe didn't want to go, but knew absence would be interpreted as guilt or cowardice or both. She left the children with Obadiah and walked through snow that came to her thighs, each step an effort, until she reached the church and stepped into warmth maintained by a fire larger than any individual family could afford. The people who gathered looked exhausted, haunted. They had survived something that would mark them for the rest of their lives, had learned that winter was not just a season, but an enemy that could kill with indifference. They sat on rough wooden benches and waited for someone to make sense of the senseless. Reverend Crane stood at the front, his voice shaking when he spoke the names of the dead. Henderson, his son Thomas, Mrs. Peyton, little Sarah Williams, 4 years old, who would never see 5. Each name a weight added to the room, pressing down on people already crushed by survival. Then the discussion turned to prevention, to how they might survive the next storm, because everyone understood now that this winter was not finished with them. And that's when Obadiah stood and spoke about the room beneath Tempe's cabin. He explained the principle. Earth maintains temperature. 5 feet down it stays around 50 degrees regardless of what happens above. Build a room with stone walls. Add minimal heat from a fire above, and you create a space where survival becomes possible even when the world turns lethal. People listened with expressions that ranged from curious to skeptical to openly hostile. When Obadiah finished, Cornelius Blackwell stood. "That's a generous explanation, Mr. Thorne, but it doesn't address the matter of Mrs. Ashford's debt to me. $152 due Christmas Day. That date has passed." The words fell into silence like stones into still water. Tempe felt every eye turned toward her, felt judgment being rendered in looks and silence. "Mr. Blackwell," Reverend Crane's voice carried weight despite its tremor, "surely we can find some accommodation. The woman just survived a deadly storm. She's offering to help the entire settlement. Can you not show mercy?" "I've already shown mercy by allowing her this long. The debt was incurred months ago. I understand people have sympathy for Mrs. Ashford, but sympathy doesn't change mathematics. Money was borrowed. Money is owed." Tempe stood. Her legs shook, but her voice remained steady. "I'm offering knowledge that could save lives. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn how to build what I built. Free of charge. No conditions. Surely that has value." Blackwell's expression didn't change. "Knowledge doesn't pay my bills or stock my shelves. The law is clear. The house is forfeit." But before he could continue, Prudence Winthrop stood. "How much does she owe?" $152. "And if we as a community helped her pay that debt, would you accept payment from multiple people?" Blackwell frowned, but after a moment nodded. "Money is money. The source doesn't matter." Prudence turned to face the gathered people. "Temperance Ashford saved my children's lives. Without the room she built, we would have frozen to death in that storm. I have $20 saved. I'll put it toward her debt." Silence. Then Obadiah stood. "I'll contribute $15. Another pause. Then Thomas Wright, a farmer who had lost his barn to the storm, but not his family, stood. "I can spare 10. One by one, people began to stand. Some offered $5. Some offered 2. An elderly woman offered 50 cents with an apology that it was all she had. Even Catherine Porter, after a long hesitation that felt like an eternity, stood and offered $3. Reverend Crane kept a running tally on paper. When everyone who was willing had contributed, he added the numbers. $107, still short by 45. Close, but not enough. Blackwell stood preparing to close his ledger, preparing to claim the cabin and everything it contained. Tempe felt the room closing in, felt the weight of mathematics that couldn't be argued with or reasoned away. Then a voice spoke from the doorway. "I'll make up the difference." Everyone turned. A man stood in the church doorway, 60 years old, perhaps dressed in a wool coat that spoke of money and authority. Snow dusted his shoulders and hat. His boots were good leather, well maintained. He carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to when he spoke. "Who are you?" Reverend Crane's question echoed what everyone was thinking. Strangers didn't appear in Bitterroot Creek during winter, didn't arrive during the aftermath of the worst storm in 40 years, unless they had business that couldn't wait. "Ezekiel Fairchild, land agent from Helena. I came to assess storm damage for the territorial government." He walked down the aisle, each footstep loud on the wooden floor. People shifted to let him pass, creating a path to where Tempe stood beside Obadiah, both of them still processing what he had said about making up the difference. Ezekiel stopped in front of Tempe and studied her with eyes that catalogued details the way a surveyor maps terrain. Her work-worn hands, the exhaustion written into her face, the way she stood straight despite weeks of labor that would have broken most men. "I arrived in Helena 3 days before the storm hit. Spent it at the telegraph office while reports came in from settlements across the territory. 4 people dead here, 7 in Phillipsburg, 12 in Deer Lodge, 38 in the outlying homesteads. 93 dead in Montana Territory from one storm. But Bitterroot Creek had something the others didn't. One family that survived in perfect health despite having 2 young children and taking in neighbors during the worst of it. He turned to address the assembled people. "I've spent the day interviewing survivors. I've heard remarkable things about Mrs. Ashford and her underground shelter. I've seen many methods of winter survival in my years with the land office, but I've never encountered someone who understood geothermal principles well enough to apply them practically without formal training." Back to Tempe. "What you built isn't just clever, it's revolutionary for frontier settlements. The territorial government has an interest in seeing such methods spread. Lives saved translate to productive citizens' established communities' tax revenue. Your innovation has value beyond this settlement." Cornelius Blackwell stood his ledger open. "Value is one thing, Mr. Fairchild. Payment is another. The debt is $152. "I'm aware. I'll pay the remaining $45 of Mrs. Ashford's debt, on one condition." Tempe's chest tightened. There was always a condition, always a price beyond money. "What condition?" "That you agree to work with me to document your methods. Detailed plans, measurements, instructions that can be distributed to other settlements. I want to hire you as a consultant to the Territorial Land Office. $50 for complete documentation of your underground shelter design plus the $45 to settle your debt. $95 total." The number hung in the air like smoke. $95. More than Daniel had made in 3 months of logging. More than Tempe had held at one time in her entire life. "You want to pay me? I want to employ you. Your knowledge has already saved lives. With proper documentation and distribution, it could save hundreds more across Montana Territory. That's worth investment." He pulled a leather wallet from his coat and counted out bills. $45 went to Cornelius Blackwell, who accepted them with an expression suggesting he had bitten into something sour. $50 went to Tempe, the paper crisp and new in her hands, more real than anything that had happened in the past month. "The debt is settled. Mrs. Ashford, I'll return in 1 week to begin the documentation work. Have your thoughts organized by then. Measurements, materials list, construction sequence. Everything someone with basic carpentry skills would need to replicate what you built." He left as abruptly as he had arrived, disappearing into the winter evening. The church erupted in conversation. People crowded around Tempe, asking questions, offering congratulations, their voices overlapping into chaos. She stood at the center of it, holding $50 in bills that felt like they might dissolve if she gripped them too tightly. Obadiah appeared at her side and gently guided her toward the door. "You need air." Outside, stars burned in a sky that had cleared to the hard brightness that only came after major storms. The temperature had moderated to around 0, which felt almost warm compared to the -30 they had endured. Snow reflected starlight, turning the world silver and black. Did that really just happen? Obadiah smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "It did. You're employed by the territorial government now. Quite the achievement for a woman who was digging holes in the middle of the night a month ago." Tempe looked down at the money in her hands. $50. Enough to buy wood for the rest of winter and food to see them through to spring. Enough to believe that survival wasn't just possible, but certain. "I don't know how to document anything. I just dug a hole and lined it with stones." "You did more than that. You understood something fundamental about how Earth retains heat. You applied that understanding to solve a problem everyone else thought unsolvable. That's engineering, whether you use the word or not." The week that followed passed in a blur of activity that felt surreal after the static horror of the storm. Ezekiel returned as promised, bringing a leather journal and drafting tools. He was meticulous, measuring every dimension of the underground room with precision that bordered on obsessive. He asked questions about soil composition, drainage, ventilation rates. He wanted to know how deep to dig in different soil types, how to select stones for wall construction, how to calculate the number of people a given space could support. Tempe answered as best she could, translating instinct and desperation into language that could be written down and understood by people who had never felt their children's breath turning to frost clouds in the night. Ezekiel sketched diagrams with the skill of someone trained in technical drawing, converting her rough explanations into precise illustrations that showed cross-sections and construction details. This will be published, distributed to land offices, settlement organizers, homesteaders requesting assistance. Your name will be on it as the designer. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Her name attached to something that would spread across the territory, maybe beyond. Recognition for work that had been done in secret and fear, in the desperate hope that no one would stop her before she finished. While Tempe worked with Ezekiel, families in Bitterroot Creek began to dig. Obadiah completed his own underground room first, following Tempe's design with the modifications his carpentry experience suggested. His walls were straighter than hers, his ventilation more elegantly installed, but the principle remained identical. 5 feet down, stone walls, minimal heat from above. His wife descended the ladder on a cold January evening and emerged 10 minutes later with tears running down her face, finally warm after weeks of brutal cold that had left her hands cracked and bleeding. Catherine Porter couldn't excavate beneath her cabin. The foundation was too shallow, built on bedrock rather than soil. Instead, she and Marcus constructed a partially buried room against the north wall of their home, digging 3 feet into a hillside and building stone sides with a timber roof. Not as effective as a fully underground space, but better than nothing. Her children stopped waking with numb hands. Marcus, despite his missing fingers, managed to work again, adapting his grip to compensate for what the storm had taken. By mid-January, 7 families had some version of an underground shelter. The differences were immediately visible. Those with rooms used half as much firewood. Their chimneys cracked less frequently because fires didn't need to burn at temperatures that stressed the masonry. Children developed fewer respiratory problems from smoke-filled cabins maintained at dangerous temperatures. But the change went deeper than physical comfort. People were calmer, less desperate. Winter remained hard but had lost its quality of existential threat. On January 20th, another storm moved through the valley. Not as severe as the December blizzard, but still dangerous temperatures, dropping to -15 wind, howling snow, accumulating in drifts that reached window height. This time, families with underground rooms retreated to their excavated spaces and waited out the weather in relative comfort. Those without shelters burned through wood at catastrophic rates, chose between food and fuel, made the same desperate calculations Tempe had faced in November. But no one died, not a single person. 3 people suffered minor frostbite that healed within days. Marcus Henderson fell on ice and broke his wrist. Old Mr. Talbot's chimney cracked and had to be repaired. But all 80-something residents of Bitterroot Creek emerged from the second storm alive. Reverend Crane mentioned it in his Sunday sermon on January 24th, standing at the pulpit with a voice that carried genuine wonder. We've learned something important this winter. We've learned that the simplest solutions are often the ones we overlook because they require us to think differently, to look down when everyone else looks up, to trust what seems counterintuitive. He paused, his gaze moving across the congregation until it found Tempe sitting in the back row with Verity and Silas. Some of us doubted Temperance Ashford. I include myself in that number. We thought she was struggling with grief, perhaps not thinking clearly. We were wrong. She saw a problem and she solved it. Not with more resources or harder work, but with understanding, with knowledge passed from father to daughter, with the willingness to act when others only worried. The sermon continued, but Tempe stopped hearing the words. She felt the weight of eyes on her, the attention of people who had moved from suspicion to grudging respect to something approaching gratitude. It should have felt good. Instead, it felt complicated, layered with the memory of 4 people who had died before anyone believed her, before the solution became obvious. After the service, Cornelius Blackwell approached. Tempe tensed, expecting another confrontation, another ledger opened to show debts real or imagined. But his expression was different now. Softer, something almost like regret showing through the merchant's mask he usually wore. "Mrs. Ashford, might I speak with you privately?" They walked away from the church far enough that others couldn't hear. Snow crunched under their boots. The air was cold but still carrying the crispness that came before storms broke and temperatures moderated. Cornelia stood looking at the snow-covered landscape for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong. Not about the debt was real and needed addressing, but about how I handled it, about my priorities." Tempe waited, unsure where this was leading. "I have a friend in Helena, known him 30 years, good man. Had a son 15 years old, bright boy with a future anyone would envy." He stopped, and Tempe saw something crack in his expression. "That boy died in the December storm. Their chimney failed. He froze in his bed while his parents were in the next room trying to keep the fire burning with furniture they were breaking apart for fuel. They didn't know about underground rooms or heat retention or any of it. They just knew they were losing and didn't understand why. I'm sorry. When I heard..." He finally looked at her. "I realized I've spent my life keeping perfect ledgers. Every dollar accounted for, every debt tracked. I thought I was being responsible, fair, but I was measuring the wrong things." He pulled a small leather pouch from his coat. "This is $30, plus credit at my store for materials, lumber, nails, anything you need for the next 6 months. No charge." "Mr. Blackwell, I can't..." "You can and you will. I need to believe I can still do something right. Don't take that away from me." Tempe accepted the pouch, feeling the weight of coins that represented more than money. Represented a man trying to balance ledgers that had nothing to do with dollars and debts. "Thank you. No. Thank you for reminding me that some things matter more than perfect accounting." He walked away, shoulders straighter than she had ever seen them, as if confession had lifted weight he had been carrying without knowing. Spring came slowly to Montana that year. Snow began melting in late March, revealing a landscape transformed not by the storm, but by what people had built in response to it. 11 families now had underground shelters. 5 more were in construction, waiting for the ground to thaw enough to make digging practical. The settlement had changed in ways that went beyond architecture. People spoke differently about winter, less like a sentence to be endured and more like a challenge that could be met with preparation and knowledge. Tempe's underground room had served its purpose. She and the children had survived the worst winter in memory, not just intact, but healthier than most. Verity had grown taller, stronger, spending her days reading books borrowed from families grateful for knowledge shared. Silas's cough had disappeared entirely. He played outside with energy his small body hadn't possessed in November, lungs clear, skin pink with health rather than blue with cold. Tempe herself felt different, harder in some ways, more confident in others. She had faced the worst nature could produce and had won not through strength or wealth, but through understanding, through willingness to trust what she knew even when others doubted. The victory had cost her hands that would bear scars forever, a debt that had nearly destroyed her 4 people dead before anyone listened. But she had won. In April, Obadiah asked her to marry him. The proposal came one evening after he had helped repair the cabin roof, both of them standing on the ground looking up at work completed. "We work well together. The children like me. I like them. We could build a good life." Not a declaration of love, not promises of passion or romance, just practical assessment of compatibility, the kind of calculation that made sense for 2 people who understood survival required more than emotion. Tempe thought about it for perhaps 10 seconds before answering. Yes. She didn't love Obadiah the way she had loved Daniel. That kind of love belonged to youth and certainty, neither of which she possessed anymore. But she respected him, trusted him, enjoyed his steady presence and the way he approached problems with the same methodical patience he brought to carpentry. That was enough, more than enough. They married in May, a small ceremony at the church with the whole settlement in attendance. Cornelius Blackwell stood beside Tempe in the absence of her father, the irony not lost on anyone present. Prudence Winthrop cried through the entire service, tears of joy that someone could find happiness after enduring what Tempe had survived. By summer, the underground room had become a normal part of their lives. In warm months, they used it for food storage, taking advantage of the constant 52 degrees to preserve meat and vegetables. Butter stayed fresh down there when it would have melted and spoiled above. Milk lasted days longer. The space that had saved their lives in winter now made summer more comfortable, and Tempe found herself grateful for her father's wisdom in ways that extended beyond survival. The following winter brought storms, but nothing approaching the December blizzard. Families retreated to their underground rooms when temperatures dropped, emerging when weather moderated, the rhythm becoming routine rather than desperate. No one died. No one lost fingers or toes to frostbite. Children grew healthy and strong rather than thin and sickly. The mathematics of survival had changed, and the change was visible in every face, every family that made it through winter intact. On Christmas Day of 1889, 2 years after Cornelius had given his original deadline for the debt, the settlement held a special celebration. Not just for the holiday, but for the anniversary of transformation, the moment when everything had changed. Reverend Crane invited Tempe to stand at the front of the church during the service. She did so reluctantly, uncomfortable with attention, preferring to remain in the background where her work spoke louder than her presence. 2 years ago, this woman taught us something we desperately needed to learn. Not through lectures or sermons, but through action born from necessity. She showed us that survival isn't about working harder or burning more. It's about understanding, about listening to what the earth has been trying to tell us since the beginning. He turned to Tempe directly. On behalf of this community, I want to thank you for your courage when we offered doubt, for your wisdom when we provided skepticism, and for sharing what you learned even after we had given you every reason to keep it secret. The congregation erupted in applause that echoed off the wooden walls and made Tempe's face burn. She nodded acknowledgement and quickly returned to her seat beside Obadiah, Verity, and Silas. Her family now. Not the one she had imagined when Daniel was alive, but the one circumstance and choice had created. After the service, several families approached with gifts, preserved foods, hand-knitted items for the children, a beautiful quilt from Catherine Porter stitched with a pattern that looked like stone walls fitted together. Catherine held it out with hands that still bore scars from the winter that had taken her husband's fingers. "I'm sorry for what I said after the storm. You didn't deserve that." Tempe accepted the quilt, feeling the weight of hours spent stitching the apology worked into every seam. "You were hurting, I understood. Still, you saved us all, even those of us too stubborn or frightened to see it at first." As the years passed, the story of Temperance Ashford and her underground room spread beyond Bitterroot Creek. Settlers in Wyoming heard about it and began experimenting with similar designs. Families in the Dakotas adapted the principle to their soil conditions. Agricultural extension agents recommended the technique for barns and storage buildings where temperature stability mattered. Ezekiel's documentation was published in 1890, distributed widely through territorial land offices. It became required reading for homesteaders filing claims in Montana. People arriving to establish new settlements received copies along with their land grants, learning about underground construction before experiencing their first winter. Tempe never sought fame or recognition. She continued to live quietly in Bitterroot Creek with Obadiah and the children. She helped neighbors when asked, sharing knowledge freely now that secrecy no longer mattered. She tended her garden. She lived each day with the awareness that survival was a choice renewed constantly rather than a destination reached once and forgotten. Verity married at 27, moving to Idaho with her husband, who worked as a surveyor for the railroad. Before they built their home, Verity wrote asking for advice about underground rooms. Tempe and Obadiah traveled to Idaho that summer and helped excavate the foundation for a shelter identical to the one Tempe had built years before. Standing in that hole with her daughter passing knowledge across generations, Tempe felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with money or recognition. This was legacy. This was what mattered. Silas became a stonemason, learning the trade from Obadiah and eventually surpassing his stepfather in technical skill. He specialized in earth-sheltered buildings, incorporating underground or partially buried spaces into homes, barns, and public structures across Montana. When asked where he learned his techniques, he always gave the same answer. "My mother taught me. She taught me that the earth will hold you if you let it." Temperance Ashford died in 1923 at the age of 69. Obadiah survived her by 4 years, living alone in the cabin they had shared, going down into the underground room on cold nights. Not because he needed the warmth, but because being there made him feel close to someone who had understood that salvation sometimes required digging deeper rather than reaching higher. They were buried side by side in Bitterroot Creek Cemetery, their graves marked by a simple granite stone that Silas had cut and polished himself. Below their names and dates, a single line carved with precision that matched his mother's determination. She dug for warmth and found a way forward. The cabin became a historical site in 1930, preserved by the state as an example of frontier innovation. The underground room was left intact, visitors descending that ladder throughout the decades, touching stone walls placed by a widow's bleeding hands, feeling the temperature that never changed regardless of season. The thermometer Tempe had hung on the wall still read 52 degrees in winter, 54 in summer. Year after year, decade after decade, the earth doing what it had always done, holding warmth, maintaining constancy, offering survival to those willing to trust its nature. Some truths are eternal, waiting beneath our feet for those brave enough to dig.